Hey everyone, I'm Brendan, and in today's video, I'm going to talk about video games that have gotten banned or censored across multiple countries. From controversial content to explicit violence, these games made waves for all the wrong reasons, or right reasons, depending on who you are. So I don't waste your time, let's quickly dive into the top 20 most controversial and banned video games ever made. Beginning on the list, let's take a look at Fahrenheit, known in some regions as Indigo Prophecy. This interactive drama game pushed boundaries with its graphic depictions of violence and sexual content. The game's story, about a murder mystery mixed with supernatural elements, was a little too much for some countries, leading to bans in Australia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Fahrenheit was one of the early examples of video games aiming for cinematic storytelling, but its mature themes made it a tough sell in certain regions. What's also notable is that Fahrenheit experimented with player choice and branching narratives, helping lay the foundation for modern narrative-driven games, and for Telltale Games to go bankrupt. Next up, we've got Dead Rising, a zombie survival game where players must fend off waves of zombies in a mall. But as we know, not everyone appreciates extreme violence. I'm looking at you, Australia. And this game also got banned in countries like Germany and the UAE for its amount of gore. The game's portrayal of violence and disposable enemies made it hard for some countries to look past, leading to widespread bans in certain regions. Despite this, the Dead Rising series remains a classic in the survival horror genre. The game's open world setting and creative use of everyday objects as weapons helped redefine the zombie survival genre. We can't talk about controversial games without mentioning Wolfenstein: The New Order. This reboot/remake of the classic first-person shooter series was all about fighting Nazis in an alternate history where the Nazis won World War II. While the game was critically acclaimed, its portrayal of Nazis and their imagery led to bans in Germany and other countries. Despite the controversy, it remains one of the most respected shooters of its generation. The game's ability to address complex themes, like resistance and oppression, made it stand out not only as a shooter but also as a commentary on the power of video games to tackle sensitive subjects. Plus, who doesn't like to shoot up some Nazis? Let's talk about Duke Nukem Forever, a game that's known for its inappropriate humor and over-the-top violence. The game was banned in several countries for its misogynistic themes and explicit content, particularly in Australia, Germany, and Brazil. Duke Nukem's crude humor didn't sit well with many, and this game became a prime example of how humor and violence might cross the line in video games. Ironically, despite the controversy, Duke Nukem Forever still gained a cult following, with fans praising its unapologetic and chaotic design. Most other people just think the game kinda sucks. At number 16, we have Battlefield 4, a military shooter that gained attention for its portrayal of modern warfare, including terrorist activities. Several countries like China and parts of the Middle East banned it for political reasons. They took issue with how certain countries and events were depicted, making it an early example of the potential political ramifications in video games. Interestingly, Battlefield 4 was praised for its realistic combat mechanics and graphics, making it one of the most technically impressive games of its generation. Can you believe The Sims 4 made this list? Me neither. It's only a life simulation game for 12-year-olds, but they caught the attention of censors because of its LGBTQ content. The ability to create same-sex relationships in the game sparked controversy in some countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Indonesia, leading to some restrictions or bans. Not all cultures were ready to embrace these features, but what we can all agree on is how no one has a clue what the fuck Simlish is. Let's now discuss Resident Evil 5. This game became a controversy machine because of its portrayal of African villagers as mindless zombies. Critics argued that the game's depiction of Africa and its inhabitants was racist. Countries like South Africa and UAE banned it for this reason, while others heavily censored it. Despite the controversy, Resident Evil 5 still made a lasting impact on the survivor horror genre, but it's definitely a game that got people talking, not always for the right reasons. Interestingly, the developers later addressed some of the criticisms, including adding more context to the story setting in future releases. The problem I have with this game is how racist it is to zombies. Now let's talk about State of Emergency, a game that was all about chaos. Players took control of a rebel during a dystopian uprising, wreaking havoc and fighting against a regime, or some shit like that. The violence in the game was incredibly intense, and its portrayal of anarchy rubbed some countries the wrong way. Germany, South Korea, and Singapore all banned it. The game's satirical take on politics and government control hurt some governments' feelings, and was too much for some regions to handle. It's interesting to note that State of Emergency was also seen as a response to the increasingly corporate nature of the gaming industry in the early 2000s, making it a product of its time, and definitely still relevant today. At number 12, we've got a game that took players into a post-apocalyptic world, Fallout 3. While the game was praised for its open world and narrative choices, it faced criticism for its portrayal of drug use. In particular, the in-game chemicals like jet and morphine was a point of contention. I know what you're thinking, yeah, it's pretty stupid. countries like Australia and Germany banned it, while others like South Korea imposed heavy censorship of the game. Despite this, Fallout 3 still managed to become one of the most beloved RPGs of its time. In fact, the game's influence can still be felt today, with its moral choices, vast open world, and the huge amount of bugs setting the stage for many RPGs developed afterwards. Next on the list is Hotline Miami, a top-down action game known for its fast-paced violence and retro aesthetic. The game didn't shy away from brutal combat and presented a storyline that was as disturbing as it was crazy. Germany and Australia banned the game, citing its disturbing portrayal of violence and drugs. The game was so intense apparently that even South Korea banned it. Yet despite the bans, Hotline Miami became a cult hit, praised for its innovative gameplay and bold approach to storytelling. Its unique combination of brutal action and electronic music created an atmosphere that made it one of the most unforgettable indie games of its time. Dead or Alive 5, known for its extreme sexualization of female characters, faced bans in places like UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore. The game's use of revealing costumes and lewd camera angles didn't sit well with conservative countries. Despite the bans, Dead or Alive 5 still managed to become a highly popular competitive fighter, thanks to its fun, dynamic gameplay. Interestingly, Dead or Alive became infamous for its over-the-top fan service, but it also gained recognition for its innovative combat mechanics. I personally don't have a problem with the game, that's just my thoughts.
My deception rules all of creation!
Next up is Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, a tactical shooter that gained significant attention for its portrayal of terrorism and military conflicts. The game faced bans in countries like China and UAE due to its political and sensitive themes, especially in the wake of real-world terrorism events. Even countries like Saudi Arabia took issue with how the game portrayed certain Middle Eastern countries, leading to bans or censorship. Despite the controversies, Rainbow Six Siege became a massive success, especially in the esports community, with its tactical team-based gameplay becoming a big hit in competitive gaming. And number 8, we've got Manhunt, a game that took violence to an entirely new level. Good or bad, it's up to you. It definitely went to a level for sure. Released by Rockstar Games in 2003, this game was infamous for its gritty, graphic depictions of murder, with players sneaking through dark environments to eliminate enemies in the most brutal and sadistic ways possible. The disturbing imagery and highly realistic violence made it one of the most controversial games of its time. Manhunt was quickly banned in several countries, including Australia, surprise surprise, New Zealand, and Germany, with many arguing it was simply too violent for players to handle. Interestingly, despite the bans, the game developed a cult following and became a major topic in debates about the portrayal of violence in video games. Moving on, let's talk about a game that directly tackled a real-life war. This military shooter was based on the events of the Iraq War and put players in the middle of one of the most brutal battles in recent history. When it was announced in 2009, it sparked a lot of outrage. Countries like Iraq, Iran, and several Middle Eastern countries immediately banned it due to its realistic depiction of war. The game was delayed for years, and even after its release, it received backlash. It's one of the few games that reflects the real-world consequences of military conflict so directly. Despite the initial backlash, the developers continued to work on the game, and eventually released it, trying to honor the real-life stories of the soldiers involved. Alright, now let's talk about The Witcher 2. This game earned praise for its intricate story and mature themes, and vast improvement over the first Witcher game, but it also caught the attention of censors due to its graphic sexual content and violence. Countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and India banned or heavily censored it. The game's blend of fantasy, politics, and nudity pushed the limits for what was acceptable in these regions, showing just how much the cultural context of a game can shape its reception. The Witcher series would go on to become one of the most respected RPG franchises, with The Witcher 3 especially becoming a game that pushed boundaries in terms of story and world building. I personally don't have a problem with the game.
A pleasant day to you, m'lady. Witcher.
Anyway, moving on. Up next, we've got a game that wasn't shy about its offensive nature, Postal 2. This game was banned in over 8 countries as it was a chaotic mess of ultra-violence, absurd humor, and grotesque content. You play as a maniacal character named the Postal Dude, who embarks on a violent rampage through a town. Players could do things like set fire to cats or urinate on their enemies. It's safe to say this game was too much for countries like Germany, Australia, and even South Korea, all of which would ban it. Despite the bans, Postal 2 became a cult classic, praised for its dark humor and satirical take on violence. I was probably too young to play this one when it came out, thankfully. I might have developed more psychopathic tendencies than I already have. Now we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 and the infamous No Russian Mission. Released in 2009, Modern Warfare 2 was a massive hit, but it also sparked an uproar with one specific level where players take part in a terrorist attack at an airport. The mission, where you participate in the massacre of civilians, left many players in shock. or at least I hope so, and was quickly banned in countries like China, Saudi Arabia, and Vietnam. Even though players could skip the mission, the controversy surrounding it was undeniable. This mission raised important debates about the responsibility of game developers when depicting sensitive real-world events, and it forever changed the way violence in video games was viewed by critics and regulators alike. And number 3, we've got one of the most iconic games of all time, GTA San Andreas. The GTA series has always been about pushing boundaries, especially in 3D graphics, but San Andreas pushed a little too far in, no pun intended, with the infamous Hot Coffee mod. This mod unlocked a hidden minigame involving explicit sexual content, and when it was discovered, countries like Australia, China, and the UAE stepped in to ban the game. Even though Rockstar later removed the content, the damage was done. San Andreas became a symbol of the controversy surrounding adult content in gaming. Interestingly, the hot coffee scandal led to a renewed focus on video game ratings and stricter regulations on the content for years to come. I say bring it back, but I'm just one person. In second, let's talk about one of the pioneers of video game violence, Mortal Kombat. When this game hit arcades in 1992, it introduced us to fatalities. Fun, gruesome finishing moves that became the hallmark of the series. I mean, that's the only reason I play it. I'm not a psychopath or anything. Unsurprisingly, this led to bans in countries like Australia, obviously, Germany, and Brazil, who couldn't handle the intense amount of gore and blood. Mortal Kombat also pushed the creation of the ESRB, a ratings board designed to regulate video game content. In a way, Mortal Kombat's controversial violence helped shape the industry we know today. In a good or bad way, it's up to you. It also sparked a fierce debate on whether video games could be considered an art form, with some arguing that its violence was too extreme, while others praised it for its creative combat system. And finally, at number 1, we've got Manhunt 2, the notorious title from Rockstar Games. This game was banned in over 10 countries for one simple reason: graphic violence. Players engaged in brutal killings, using everyday objects like plastic bags to strangle their victims. The amount of gore and sadism in this game was unlike anything in the game at that point, which says a lot. Countries like Australia, again obviously, New Zealand and the UK banned it outright, with others like Germany imposing strict censorship. But what's interesting is how much of an impact Manhunt 2 had on the debate over video game violence, pushing regulators to become even stricter in the classifications. In fact, the controversy around the game led to a widespread conversation about the responsibility of game developers in depicting violence. That wraps up the list of 20 games that were banned or heavily censored across multiple countries. Some of these games pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable, and in many cases sparked massive debates about censorship, freedom of expression, and cultural values. Which one shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, blah blah blah. See you next time.